Most people imagine a forest cabin as a place to disconnect. No traffic, no neighbors, just trees, quiet, and the sense that nothing can reach you if you're far enough away. That was the appeal for me. I wasn't looking for isolation as much as I was looking for routine without interruption. The cabin belonged to a relative who barely used it anymore. It sat several miles off the nearest paved road, accessible by a narrow dirt track that wound through dense woods. There was no cell service, no internet, just a landline that worked when it felt like it. I arrived in the late afternoon, unloaded my things, and spent the first hour doing what I always did when I stayed there. I checked the doors, made sure the generator was running. Walked the perimeter once, more out of habit than concern. The trees stood close together, blocking most of the sky, and the air smelled damp even though it hadn't rained. Inside, the cabin was simple. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a living area with a wood stove, and a couch that had clearly been there longer than I'd been alive. Everything creaked in a familiar way when I moved around. The sounds were predictable. As evening set in, the forest grew quieter. Birds disappeared. Insects took over. I cooked dinner, cleaned up, and settled in with a book, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. It felt exactly like I expected it to feel, still, contained, and uneventful. Before bed, I stepped onto the porch and looked out into the dark. The tree line swallowed the light from the cabin after only a few feet. I didn't see anything move. I didn't hear anything unusual. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to sleep assuming the night would pass the same way all the others had. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something touching the cabin. Not a knock, not footsteps, just a slow, uneven brushing sound, like fingertips dragging along the outside wall. It moved from one end of the cabin toward the other, steady enough that I could follow it in my head. I stayed still, listening. The sound stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the low hum of the generator and the distant noise of insects outside. I waited for the brushing to start again, but it didn't. I told myself it was an animal. A deer rubbing against the siding. A bear passing too close. The forest was full of things that made unfamiliar sounds at night. I checked the time. Just after 2 in the morning. I didn't get out of bed. I didn't turn on the light. I stayed where I was, listening harder than I should have, letting every small noise stretch longer than it needed to. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was closer to the window. The sun was lighter now, more deliberate, like something tracing the frame instead of leaning against it. It moved slowly, pausing now and then, as if whatever was outside was deciding where to go next. I held my breath without realizing it. The sound stopped directly beneath the window, right where the glass met the wall. Nothing else happened. After a while, I convinced myself it had moved on, that whatever animal it was had lost interest. I lay there until my breathing returned to normal, telling myself the forest always felt louder when you were half asleep. When I finally drifted off again, I made a quiet decision not to look out the window in the morning. I didn't remember falling asleep again, but I woke up before dawn with the same tight awareness in my chest. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. The insects that had been constant the night before were gone, leaving a flat stillness that made the space feel hollow. I lay there for a while, listening, replaying the sounds from earlier in my head. In the cold light of morning, they already felt smaller, easier to explain away. I got up, dressed, and avoided the window like I'd promised myself I would. When I finally stepped outside, the forest looked unchanged. No broken branches, no disturbed ground. The dirt around the cabin was hard-packed, marked only by my own footprints from the day before. Whatever had been there had left no trace I could point to. I spent the morning doing small, unnecessary tasks. Cleaning surfaces that were already clean, restacking firewood that hadn't moved. Anything that kept me from standing still too long. By early afternoon, the unease had faded into the background. The forest returned to its normal rhythm. Birds came back. Wind moved through the trees. The cabin felt like a place again, not just a shell. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual. Sometime after midnight, the brushing sound returned. It started on the opposite side of the cabin this time, slow and deliberate, moving along the wall in the same steady way. I sat up in bed, fully awake now, listening as it traveled past the window without stopping. Then it changed. The sound lifted, moving higher, dragging lightly across the glass. Not tapping, not scratching, just pressure, shifting slightly, like something leaning in to get closer. I stayed perfectly still, eyes fixed on the dark shape of the window. I didn't want to confirm anything by looking. I didn't want to give it a reaction. The sound lingered there longer than before. When it finally moved away, it didn't fade into the forest. It stopped abruptly, as if it had reached the edge of something it couldn't cross. By the third night, I stopped pretending it was nothing. I didn't hear anything when I went to bed. The forest settled the way it always did, insects filling the dark with noise, the generator humming steadily outside. I lay awake longer than usual, waiting for the brushing to start, tense in a way that made time stretch. When it finally came, it didn't circle the cabin. It went straight to the window. The sound pressed against the glass, heavier than before, like weight being tested carefully. The window didn't rattle. The frame didn't creak. Whatever was there wasn't trying to force its way in. It was just there. I could feel it, the way you can feel someone standing too close behind you without turning around. The insects outside went quiet all at once. The sudden silence made the sound at the window feel louder, more focused. The brushing slowed, becoming irregular, like whatever was touching the glass was adjusting its position. I realized then that it never happened while I was moving. Only when I was still. Only when the cabin had settled. Like it was waiting for everything inside to quiet down first. I didn't reach for the light. I didn't move toward the window. I kept my eyes on the opposite wall and tried to breathe normally, telling myself that if I didn't acknowledge it, it would leave the way it had before. The pressure eased slightly. Not away, just lower. When the sound finally stopped, it didn't retreat along the wall. It simply wasn't there anymore. The forest noise returned slowly, unevenly, as if something had passed through it. I stayed awake until morning, certain of one thing I hadn't been before. Whatever was outside wasn't wandering. It knew exactly where I was. I left the cabin that morning without packing properly. I didn't check the perimeter. I didn't look at the window. I threw my things into the car, started the engine, and drove back down the dirt road without stopping to see if anything followed. The forest closed in behind me the way it always did, calm and ordinary, like nothing had ever touched the cabin at all. I didn't come back that season. When I eventually returned months later, it was during the day, and I didn't stay long. The cabin looked the same. No marks on the siding. No damage to the window. Nothing that suggested anything had been there. But I noticed something I hadn't before. The area beneath the bedroom window was worn smoother than the rest of the ground, like something had stood there repeatedly, shifting its weight in the same place over and over. There were no clear tracks, just a patch of earth that felt used. I didn't stay the night. I locked the door, left the lights off, and drove away before dusk. I told myself the forest wasn't dangerous, just unfamiliar. That being alone made sounds feel closer than they really were. But even now, when I stay somewhere remote, I pay attention to where the windows are. I notice how close the trees grow. I listen for the moment when the forest goes quiet all at once. Because whatever stood outside that cabin didn't try to get in. It waited until everything inside was still enough for it to matter. The cabin wasn't meant for long stays. It was something my friend's family used during hunting season. A single-room structure set deep enough into the forest that you couldn't hear the road at all. No neighbors, no nearby cabins, just trees packed tightly together in every direction. We arrived before sunset and unloaded quickly. The place had the basics: 2 bunks, a small table, a propane stove, and a generator outside that powered a few lights. The walls were thin, unfinished wood, and everything smelled faintly of pine and old dust. I volunteered to stay the night alone. It wasn't a big deal. I'd done it before in other places. The forest didn't bother me, and I liked the quiet once everyone else left. Before they drove off, we walked the area once, more out of habit than concern. The cabin sat in a small clearing, barely wide enough to let sunlight in. Beyond that, the trees closed in fast. The ground was uneven, covered in old needles and fallen branches. Once I was alone, the forest changed in small ways. Sounds carried differently. Every movement felt louder, more isolated. I cooked a simple meal, cleaned up, and kept the door open until the light faded completely. When it got dark, I shut everything down, locked the door, and turned on the single overhead light. The generator hummed steadily outside. The cabin felt contained, familiar. I went to bed early, expecting a quiet night. The kind where you wake up once or twice, listen to the forest, then fall back asleep without thinking about it. At the time, there was nothing about the place that felt wrong. Not until the night had time to settle in around it. The first sound woke me just after midnight. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, just a dull impact against the side of the cabin, followed by the soft scatter of something rolling away across the ground. I lay still, listening, trying to place it. A branch falling. A pine cone. Something small knocked loose by an animal. The forest didn't react. No sudden movement. No rush of sound pulling away from the clearing. Everything stayed the same. I waited for it to happen again. It didn't. After a while, I convinced myself it had been nothing and shifted onto my side, pulling the blanket closer. The cabin creaked softly, as it always did when I moved. A few minutes later, something hit the cabin again. This time, it struck closer to the door. The sound was heavier than before, solid enough that I felt it through the floor. Whatever it was didn't bounce or roll away. It landed and stayed where it fell. I held my breath and listened. From somewhere just outside, I heard a slow dragging sound, faint but deliberate, like something being pulled a short distance and then left there. I told myself not to imagine size, not to imagine intention. Animals bumped into things all the time. Curiosity didn't mean awareness. Still, I stayed perfectly still. A moment later, there was another impact. Lighter, higher up on the wall, not thrown, placed. The sound stopped, and the forest remained quiet, leaving me with the uncomfortable awareness that whatever was outside wasn't moving randomly. It was testing, where the cabin responded. I stayed awake for a long time after that, counting my breaths, listening for any change outside. Nothing moved. The generator hummed. The trees stayed still. Eventually, the tension dulled enough that I drifted off without realizing it. I woke again before dawn to a different kind of quiet. The generator was still running, but the forest felt muted, like the sound was being absorbed instead of carried. I got up carefully and checked the inside of the cabin. Nothing had fallen. Nothing was out of place. When I opened the door, the clearing looked the same as it had the night before. No obvious tracks. No signs of anything disturbed. Near the wall, I found what had hit the cabin. A rock. It wasn't large. Something that could be lifted with one hand. It sat close to the door, positioned neatly against the foundation, not scattered the way you'd expect if it had bounced or rolled. A few feet away, closer to the trees, there was another one. Then another. They weren't piled. They weren't random. Each one rested against the cabin at a different point, spaced evenly apart, like markers. I told myself animals moved rocks all the time. That erosion, runoff, or coincidence could explain it. The explanations felt weak, but daylight made them easier to accept. I spent the day outside, hiking short loops, keeping myself busy. The forest behaved normally. Birds moved. Wind shifted branches. Nothing followed me. Nothing made itself known. By evening, the clearing looked unchanged again. The rocks were still there. I didn't move them. That night, I went to bed with the light on. Sometime after midnight, I heard the first impact. Then another. Then another. Each one landed in a different place, spaced out in time, as if whatever was outside was being careful not to rush. When the last sound stopped, there were no more rocks left to place. By then, I wasn't thinking about animals anymore. I was thinking about space. About how close the trees were to the cabin. How little ground there was between the walls and the forest. How easy it would be to stand just beyond the edge of the clearing and never be seen. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear breathing. Just the careful impacts against the wood, each one placed with enough force to be noticed, and no more than that. When I finally forced myself to stand, the cabin felt smaller than it had earlier, like the walls were only holding because nothing outside was leaning too hard on them yet. I walked to the door and rested my hand on the lock without opening it. Something moved on the other side. Not fast, not heavy, just close enough that I could feel it through the wood, the way you can feel pressure through a closed door when someone stands too near. The sound that followed wasn't an impact. It was the slow scrape of something being adjusted along the base of the wall, closer to the hinge side of the door. The movement stopped directly beneath my hand. I stayed there longer than I should have, frozen in place, aware of my own breathing and how loud it sounded in the silence. Whatever was outside didn't try the handle. It didn't knock. It just stayed where it was, close enough that I couldn't pretend it didn't know exactly where I was standing. When it finally moved away, it didn't retreat into the forest. The pressure eased, but the clearing didn't fill with sound again. It felt like something had stepped just out of reach. I backed away from the door and sat on the bunk with the light still on, certain that if I turned it off, I'd hear the next sound much closer than the last. I didn't sleep after that. I waited for morning, sitting on the edge of the bunk with the light on and my bag packed at my feet. The generator kept running. The cabin stayed intact. Nothing else touched the walls. At first light, I opened the door and stepped outside. The rocks were still there. All of them. Every one that had hit the cabin the night before was positioned neatly along the base of the walls, spaced evenly, forming a rough outline of the structure. None of them were stacked. None of them blocked the door. They just marked where the cabin stood. I didn't move them. I loaded my things, shut the door, and left the clearing without looking back. I didn't follow the path straight out. I took a longer route through the woods, putting as much distance between myself and that place as I could. Later, when I told my friend I wouldn't be staying there again, I didn't explain why. I just said the place felt off. He didn't argue. Even now, when I walk through wooded areas, I notice where stones gather naturally and where they don't, because whatever stood outside that cabin didn't throw those rocks to scare me. It placed them to show me where I was. The cabin had been in my family for as long as I could remember. It wasn't remote in the dramatic sense, no mountain views or deep wilderness, but it sat far enough into the woods that you couldn't see another house from the porch. Just trees, undergrowth, and a narrow gravel drive that disappeared after the first bend. I went up alone in the off-season to check on things, close it up properly, make sure nothing had broken over the winter. It was the kind of task that didn't require company. The place was exactly as I'd left it months earlier, furniture covered with sheets, cabinets empty, a thin layer of dust on the windowsills. I opened everything up, aired it out, and spent the afternoon doing small repairs. By evening, the woods felt heavier. Not darker, just denser. Sounds didn't travel as far. The air felt still, like the forest had settled in around the cabin once I stopped moving. I cooked a simple dinner and ate it at the table, listening to the quiet. No wind, no distant road noise, just the occasional creak of wood as the temperature dropped. Before bed, I did one last check around the outside. The tree line was close on all sides, but nothing looked disturbed. No tracks, no broken branches. The ground was soft with old leaves, holding impressions easily. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to sleep without thinking much about it. The cabin had always been quiet at night. I expected it to stay that way. I woke up to the sound of something shifting under the cabin. At first, I thought it was the house settling. Old structures made noise, especially when the temperature dropped, but this wasn't a single creak or pop. It was a slow, dragging sound, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I lay still, listening as it passed beneath the floorboards. The sound was close enough that I could feel a faint vibration through the mattress, like something brushing against the supports below. Then it stopped. The silence that followed felt deliberate, too complete. I waited for the forest to fill it again, for insects, wind, anything, but nothing came. I told myself it was probably an animal sheltering underneath. A raccoon, a fox, something that had found its way under the structure to get out of the cold. I tried to go back to sleep. A few minutes later, the sound returned. This time, it wasn't moving. It stayed directly beneath the center of the cabin, right under the bedroom. I could hear faint pressure against the floor, like weight being adjusted carefully, testing where the boards gave the least. I held my breath without realizing it. There was a soft thump, muted by layers of wood and insulation, followed by another slow drag. Whatever was under there wasn't digging. It wasn't scrambling. It was repositioning. I reached for my phone out of habit, then remembered there was no signal. The screen's glow felt too bright in the dark, so I turned it face down again. After a long stretch of silence, the sound faded, retreating toward the edge of the cabin and then disappearing entirely. The forest noise returned in pieces, uneven and cautious. I lay awake until morning, telling myself I'd check under the cabin in daylight and confirm it had just been an animal. But even then, I already knew I wouldn't. Morning didn't make the cabin feel safer. It just made it easier to pretend nothing had happened. I moved through the place slowly, listening for any sound from beneath the floor as I made coffee and packed a few things away. Everything stayed quiet. The forest outside behaved normally. Birds moved through the trees. Wind stirred the leaves. I walked the perimeter and crouched near the low side of the cabin where there was enough space to see underneath. The ground was damp, dark with shadow. I didn't see anything unusual. No obvious tracks, no disturbed soil. just leaf litter and support beams disappearing into the dark. I told myself that was enough. I spent the day doing work that kept me busy, checking seals, replacing a loose board, anything that kept me from standing still too long. By afternoon, the memory of the sound felt less sharp, dulled by daylight and routine. That night, I went to bed earlier than planned. The sound came back almost immediately, not under the cabin this time. It started along the outside wall, a slow scrape that moved from one corner toward the bedroom. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like something dragging itself carefully to avoid making too much noise. I sat up, heart already racing, listening as it reached the spot beneath the window and stopped. There was a pause, then a soft thud directly against the underside of the floor, followed by a faint creak as weight shifted upward. I realized then that whatever had been under the cabin the night before hadn't left. It had just learned where to wait. The sound stayed there for a long time, close enough that I could feel it through the bed, patient enough that it didn't need to move at all. By then, I understood that listening wasn't helping. I sat there in the dark, trying to keep my breathing slow, trying not to react to the pressure beneath the floor. The sound wasn't constant. It came in small adjustments, wood flexing slightly, something shifting its weight just enough to test the structure. It never hit the floor hard enough to be accidental. I noticed something else then. The sounds only happened when I was in the bedroom. When I moved carefully into the living area, the pressure beneath the floor eased, not gone, just farther away. When I stepped back toward the bedroom, it returned. That realization settled in quietly, without panic. Whatever was under the cabin was tracking where I was by feel, not by sound, responding to weight, to presence. I stood still in the doorway, testing it. The pressure stayed centered beneath me, close enough that I could feel the faint vibration through the soles of my feet. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear claws or hands, just the careful redistribution of weight, like something learning the limits of the space above it. The forest outside had gone quiet again, not completely silent, just restrained, as if everything that usually moved at night had decided to wait. I backed away slowly, step by step, until I was pressed against the far wall. The pressure beneath the cabin followed, never rushing, never lagging behind. It didn't try to break through. It didn't need to. It stayed there, close enough to remind me that the floor between us was the only thing keeping us separate, and that it had plenty of time to learn how thin that separation really was. I didn't sleep at all after that. I stood there until the sky began to lighten, feeling the weight beneath the cabin recede inch by inch as daylight returned. I left as soon as there was enough light to see the ground clearly. I didn't pack carefully. I didn't eat. I grabbed what I could carry and unlocked the door, half expecting to feel something shift beneath the floor as I moved away. Nothing followed me out. The cabin stayed quiet, solid, unchanged. In daylight, it looked harmless. Just an old structure on uneven ground, raised slightly on blocks the way many cabins were. No damage underneath, no signs of digging, no disturbed soil I could point to and say this is where it was. That almost made it worse. I didn't check under the cabin again. I didn't need proof. Whatever had been there hadn't left marks because it hadn't needed to. It had used the space the way it was meant to be used. I locked the door, drove down the gravel road, and didn't stop until I reached pavement. I told myself it was exhaustion, that staying alone too long in a quiet place made your mind fill in gaps that weren't really there. I haven't stayed overnight in that cabin since. When I visit now, it's only during the day. I keep my movements steady. I don't linger in one spot longer than necessary, and I never stand still inside the bedroom, because I learned something I can't unlearn. Some places don't need to be entered to be occupied. They just need someone above them. The cabin was part of a short-term rental program, the kind meant for weekend escapes. It sat near the edge of a large forest preserve, far enough from the main road that traffic noise never reached it, but close enough that it didn't feel truly remote. I arrived just before sunset with a car full of groceries and the expectation of quiet. The listing mentioned wildlife, limited reception, and minimal neighbors. None of that bothered me. I'd stayed in similar places before without issue. The cabin itself was newer than most I'd seen. Clean lines, fresh wood, large windows facing the trees. It felt deliberately open, designed to make the forest go closer even when you were inside. The back deck extended a few feet into the tree line, close enough that branches brushed the railing when the wind picked up. I unpacked, made dinner, and left the lights on as the sky darkened. The forest beyond the windows turned into a wall of black shapes, depth impossible to judge once the interior reflected back at me. Before bed, I stepped onto the deck to take one last look. The air was still. No wind, no insects, just the quiet presence of the trees standing close together, their outlines blending into one another. I locked the doors, drew the curtains partway, and went to bed assuming the night would pass quietly. The place didn't feel threatening. It just felt watched in the way open spaces sometimes do. When there's nothing between you and what's on the other side of the glass, the first thing that pulled me out of sleep was the light, not brightness movement. A slow shift of shadow passed across the bedroom wall, tall enough to block the faint glow coming through the curtains. I lay still, watching it slide out of view, telling myself it was a branch moving in the wind. But the trees had been still when I went to bed. I listened for leaves rustling. For the deckboards creaking, nothing followed. The cabin stayed quiet, sealed, like the movement had never happened at all. I checked the time. Just after 1. I didn't get up. I stayed where I was, eyes open, letting the darkness settle back into something familiar. Eventually, the tension eased enough that I closed my eyes again. It happened a second time. The shadow moved the same way, slow and deliberate, passing across the wall at the same height. It didn't flicker or break the way branches usually did. It stayed solid from top to bottom, like something passing close to the window instead of far away. I sat up slightly and pulled the curtain back just enough to look. The deck was empty. No movement, no shifting light, just the railing and the dark line of trees beyond it, standing closer than I remembered. I let the curtain fall back into place, telling myself depth was hard to judge at night. When I lay back down, I noticed something else. The shadow had stopped passing the window. It was staying there. I lay there, staring at the spot on the wall where the shadow had settled. It didn't move. It didn't shift or flicker the way light normally did when something was outside. It held its shape, tall and narrow, cutting off the faint glow from beyond the curtains as if something was standing directly in front of the glass. I listened harder. There was no sound from the deck, no footstep, no creak of wood. The silence felt deliberate, like whatever was there understood how easily noise carried inside the cabin. I told myself it was my eyes adjusting, that my brain was filling in shapes where none existed. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, then opened them again. The shadow was still there. I sat up slowly, careful not to shift the bed too much. The moment I moved, the shadow changed. Not retreating, just adjusting its position, sliding slightly to match where I was now sitting. That was when I realized it wasn't reacting to the window. It was reacting to me. I held still again, testing it. The shadow stayed perfectly aligned with my position, blocking the same amount of light no matter where I leaned. It felt less like something casting a shadow and more like something choosing where to be seen. I didn't pull the curtain back this time. I didn't want to confirm anything with my eyes. The idea of seeing a shape on the other side of the glass felt worse than not knowing. The shadow remained for a long time, long enough that my sense of time started to slip. It didn't press against the glass. It didn't move away. It just stayed close, patient, as if it had found the right place to stand and had no reason to leave. By then, I wasn't trying to explain it anymore. I focused on staying still, on keeping my breathing slow and shallow. The shadow stayed exactly where it was, unbroken, close enough that the glass between us felt thinner than it should have. I noticed something else then. The rest of the room still had depth. Corners faded naturally into darkness. The ceiling disappeared upward the way it always did at night. The shadow didn't. It stayed uniformly dark, like it wasn't part of the room's lighting at all, like it belonged to a different set of rules. When I shifted my legs under the blanket, just slightly, the shadow adjusted again. Not following the movement itself, but correcting its position afterward, as if it were tracking where I ended up rather than how I got there. I thought about turning on the light. The idea felt wrong immediately, too final, like it would force an interaction instead of letting whatever this was remain at a distance. I stayed where I was, watching the edge of the shadow blur and sharpen in small increments, never quite resolving into anything recognizable. No outline of a head, no limbs, just height and presence. The forest outside stayed unnaturally quiet. No wind, no insects. Even the usual settling sounds of the cabin were absent, like the structure itself was holding still. After what felt like hours, the shadow began to thin. Not retreating, lowering. The dark shape slid down the wall inch by inch, as if whatever was outside was crouching or bending without stepping away from the window. When it finally dropped below the frame, the faint light returned to the wall, uneven and unfamiliar. I didn't move. I waited, certain that if I reacted too quickly, it would rise back into place. I stayed in bed until the sun came up. When the light finally pushed through the curtains, the wall looked normal again. Flat. Empty. I didn't pull the curtains back right away. I didn't check the deck. I needed the room to feel ordinary first. Eventually, I stood up and opened the curtains. The deck was exactly the way I'd left it. No marks on the boards, no disturbed furniture. The trees stood close, their branches overlapping near the railing, close enough that shadows from one could blend into another. Nothing that counted as proof. I packed up early and left the cabin hours before my reservation ended. I didn't contact the host. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want an explanation that would make me think I'd imagined it. Since then, I've avoided places with large windows facing unbroken darkness. I keep curtains closed at night, even when I'm high off the ground. I pay attention to where shadows fall and whether they change when I move. Because whatever stood outside that cabin didn't need to come in. It just needed to know where I was standing. And it knew. The cabin wasn't marked on most maps. It belonged to a friend of a friend, passed around quietly to people who wanted somewhere cheap and isolated for a few days. No neighbors, no nearby trails, no signs pointing the way. You had to know how to get there. I arrived in the late afternoon, following a series of unmarked turns until the road narrowed into something barely wide enough for one car. The forest pressed in on both sides, branches arching overhead in places, blocking out the sky. The cabin sat in a small clearing, low to the ground and older than it looked in the photos. The wood had darkened with age, and the windows reflected the trees so clearly that it was hard to tell where the forest ended and the building began. Inside, it was quiet in a way that felt complete. No hum of electricity, no distant traffic, just the faint creak of wood as the structure adjusted to my movement. There was a small propane heater, a table, and a narrow bed pushed against one wall. I unpacked slowly, letting the place settle around me. I checked the doors and windows out of habit, then stepped outside to walk the clearing once before dark. The tree line was uneven, tighter in some places than others, but nothing stood out. No paths, no markers, just forest. As evening came on, the light faded quickly. Shadows filled the clearing, and the cabin seemed to recede into them, like it was becoming part of the woods instead of standing apart from them. I went back inside, lit a lantern, and sat down to eat, listening to the forest settle for the night. Everything felt still, contained, and exactly as advertised. At the time, there was nothing about the place that felt unusual. It was just quiet enough that I noticed when the quiet finally started to feel intentional. The sound started just after dark. At first, it blended in with the forest, something shifting at the edge of the clearing, leaves brushing against each other as the night settled. I didn't pay it much attention. Forests were never completely still. Then it came closer. Not footsteps. No clear rhythm. Just the faint compression of leaves and soil, slow enough that it felt deliberate rather than accidental. I sat quietly, listening as the sound traced the edge of the clearing instead of cutting across it. It never crossed into the open space. It stayed just beyond the reach of the lantern light, circling where the trees grew closest together. I couldn't hear it clearly enough to point to a direction. The sound seemed to come from wherever I wasn't listening. I told myself it was an animal moving cautiously. A deer. Something curious but unsure. That explanation worked for a few minutes. Then the sound stopped directly outside one of the windows. I held still, eyes fixed on the dark glass. The reflection showed only the interior of the cabin, lantern light bouncing back at me. I waited for a shape to appear behind it. Nothing did. After a long pause, the sound started again, this time along the side of the cabin. Leaves shifted closer to the wall, then farther away, like something pacing a short distance back and forth. I stayed where I was, listening to it pass the door without touching it, then move on toward the far corner of the structure. When it completed the circuit and returned to the first window, it stopped again. That was when I realized it wasn't moving randomly. It was tracing the outline of the cabin. I stayed awake for a long time after that, tracking the sound in my head as it moved. It never rushed. It never stumbled. The pacing stayed slow and consistent, like whatever was out there didn't need to hurry. I noticed that it paused longer near certain spots. The windows, the door, lingering just long enough for me to register its position before moving on again. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear anything brush against the walls, just the quiet pressure of something occupying space close enough to matter. Eventually, the sound stopped altogether. The sudden stillness felt worse than the movement. The forest didn't fill back in right away. No insects, no distant noise, just the lantern hissing softly inside the cabin. I told myself that meant it had left. I was starting to relax when I heard it again, closer this time. Not in the leaves, on the wood. A faint scrape moved along the outside wall, slow and careful, following the same path I'd already memorized. It wasn't scratching, it wasn't testing the structure. It was feeling it. When it reached the door, the sound changed slightly, the scrape becoming softer, more controlled, like whatever was there understood where the wood gave and where it didn't. I stood up without meaning to and immediately regretted it. The sound stopped. I stayed frozen, heart racing, aware of how loudly the cabin creaked under my weight. I waited for the sound to resume somewhere else. It didn't. After a few seconds, the scrape started again, but now it was higher up on the wall, closer to where my head would be if I were standing on the other side. That was when I understood it wasn't tracing the cabin anymore. It was adjusting to me. By then, the cabin felt too small to move around in. I stayed standing, afraid that sitting or lying down would give it something to adjust to again. The scrape on the wall slowed, becoming more precise, like whatever was outside was narrowing its focus. It stopped directly beside the window. I didn't hear glass shift. I didn't hear pressure. Just the sense of something close enough that the wall between us felt less like a barrier and more like a suggestion. I tested it without meaning to. I shifted my weight slightly. The scrape followed. Not immediately. Just after, correcting itself, settling into the new position like it was confirming where I was now. It didn't react to sound. It reacted to presence. The lantern flickered once, then steadied. The forest outside stayed quiet, holding its breath. I realized then that it hadn't circled the cabin to find an entrance. It had circled to learn the shape of the space, to understand how much room there was inside and how that space changed when I moved. The scrape lowered inch by inch until it was level with the floor. Then it stopped completely. I stood there in the dim light, listening to nothing, aware of how loud my breathing sounded in the silence. After a long stretch of time, the forest slowly came back. A few insects. A distant branch shifting. Normal sounds returning carefully, like they were unsure if they were allowed to move again. The scrape didn't come back. But I didn't feel alone. I stayed awake until dawn, never sitting down, never turning my back on the wall where the sound had stopped, certain that if I gave it another position to learn, it would come back to match it. I left the cabin at first light. I didn't pack properly. I didn't check the windows. I stepped outside and stood in the clearing for a moment, waiting to feel something move now that I was exposed. Nothing did. The forest looked ordinary in daylight. The ground showed no tracks I could point to. No disturbed leaves. No marks on the cabin walls. If anything had been there, it hadn't needed to leave evidence. I locked the door anyway, even though I knew it didn't matter. I didn't go back. When I told the person who'd given me the directions that I wouldn't be staying there again, they didn't ask why. They just said some people didn't like how close the trees felt. Since then, I've learned to notice how spaces respond when you move through them, whether sound follows you or waits for you to stop, whether silence fills in naturally or holds its shape. Because whatever walked around that cabin didn't want to come inside. It just wanted to understand how much of the space was mine and how much of it wasn't.